foolishly slipped and broke my hip. So I was in the hospital in Pennsylvania, and as soon as possible flew home. But the surgeon said I couldn't come unless somebody took care of me. And my son Sam, who is here tonight and who is now a member of the board, said that he would take time off from his law practice and bring his aged father back to the Dayton airport. So we flew together and went into the airport and sat down close to the revolving globe. We were waiting for our car to come from Richmond to transport us. And as we sat there, he said, "Dad, what's wrong with that globe?" Well, I had never really looked at it. I've been walking past it for 14 years. That shows how unattentive I was. But the moment I really looked at it, I saw right away what was wrong. It was rotating to the west, rolling like that, which would, of course, make the sun come up in the west, wouldn't it? So, as soon as I got home here, I found the name of the president of the company that put it up. A company in Dayton that, what do they make? National Cash Register. You've heard of that company, haven't you? And right away I had the loveliest letter from the president, very gracious, thanked me for writing. He said, "We've been paying for that for 14 years and we never knew it was going in the wrong direction. And if you take a good look at it now, it is going in the right direction." Now, why do I mention that to you here tonight? Because our task is to turn the world around. We have no small plans. Make no small plans. They have no power to move men's hearts. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the early Christians was that they literally turned the world around. If you read carefully the 17th chapter of the book of Acts, telling of the growth of this strange fellowship, you will find in that chapter a remark made by the people of Thessalonica about the Christians. These are the ones who have turned the world upside down. One of the most remarkable sentences of the entire Bible, and not really an exaggeration. The changes that were brought were not minimal changes. They were enormous changes. Jesus said something bigger than the temple is here. The people who heard him thought that the temple was the biggest thing in the world. It was enormous. The amount of land on which it stood is still large. though most of it is empty in Jerusalem at this moment. All of it is empty except for the area where the Mosque of Omar stands. It was big, all right. But that which came was vastly bigger. Instead of a hierarchical priesthood, there was suddenly a movement in which the rank and file made all the difference. The merchant told the customer told the merchant, the teacher told the student told the teacher, the wife told the husband. It was not a small change, but an enormous one, because everybody was in the act. And they did change the world. They changed enormously the status of women. How striking that in a world in which women had very little opportunity for real leadership, we know that the leader of the first church of Europe was a woman, namely Lydia of Philippi. They had no buildings, but that made no difference, because they gathered wherever they were, very frequently in private homes, so that one of the most important references in the New Testament is the church that is in their house. The whole attitude toward violence was challenged. And it was partly challenged by many of these early Christians being the victims of violence, as in the Colosseum of Rome. They made enormous changes. And then the striking thing is that in all subsequent years, the genuine advancement that has normally come in the spiritual life has not come by slow, gradual, steady advance, but by striking new developments. Often light coming right out of the darkness. How amazing that in the year in which Plato's Academy was closed by the edict of Justinian, that was the year 529, Benedict started his work that very year. And the Benedictine movement was a continuing light in the Dark Ages and in the subsequent centuries. When you think of what the Benedictines did just in Great Britain, you are filled with hope and amazement. A big step in my own spiritual life came when I first visited Iona, that beautiful island off the west coast of Scotland. And there became a friend of Lord MacLeod, and actually I was able to participate in a minor way in some of the rebuilding of the old buildings of the Cathedral of the Isles. But in thinking of them, I've often thought of that Benedictine fellowship that was developed there nearly 800 years ago, and of the wonderful influence that they had on all the north of Britain. Going into Scotland, mainland, where often the people certainly could not read, did not know how to bake bread, didn't know how to work iron, or anything that we would call advancement in civilization. And these people just simply penetrated that entire culture. They thought in very big terms. They may have been small people individually, but they were small people who were engaged in an enterprise of genuine magnitude. But this same thing can be said over and over. All of you know how Francis roused the hill country of Italy. If you go to Italy, do go to Assisi, climb the hill, and see where Francis lived, and think how one poor little fellow who had been a soldier made an enormous difference. He developed the poor little brothers and the poor little sisters. But not satisfied with that, he developed a discipline suitable to ordinary people in ordinary life. People with ordinary jobs, with taxes to pay, with household responsibilities. And he called this, of course, the third order. Or we can go on down and show this happened over and over. The Reformation was just such a time. The Reformation was really an explosion. I have in my study a book that I've just received on Martin Luther and the way in which he developed the Theologia Germanica for the sake of the common people around him, taking this classic and making it available to the ordinary men and women of Germany. And some of you here tonight, I'm looking at some people now, find that your greatest spiritual experience has come because of what happened early in the 16th century. Tonight, two young men in the uniform of the Salvation Army were kind enough to play hymns for us on the brass so that we could hear it upstairs, on the stairways, and as we came in. And it made me think again how much we owe to this great development of the Salvation Army a century ago. You see, what happens in the spiritual life is that things get dull. They become commonplace. the fire burns very, very low. And then there has to be something of tremendous vigor to awaken people again, to enlarge their vision, and make them see the greatness of the faith which they have taken for granted. And that's what the Salvation Army did. If you go to London as tourists, I strongly advise you go about a mile north of St. Paul's, just north of the city wall, and there you will find a very moving scene. The nonconformist burial ground, which represents the background of the great majority of us here in this great company tonight. There you will see the grave of Susanna Wesley and of George Fox and 1,000 other Quakers, many of whom died in prison. There you will see the grave of Isaac Watts, the most famous hymn writer that ever lived. There you will see the grave of Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, and John Bunyan, and on and on. I could go with these. And the connection with the Salvation Army is this. Major Vaughn knows this very well, and it may be that his sons know it also. The Salvation Army, as it was being formed, couldn't find any place to have a meeting. Nobody would let them in. People were afraid of them. Obviously, they disturbed the current lethargy. And I am proud as a Quaker to say that the first place they were allowed to meet was when they were allowed to put up their tent on the Quaker burial ground at Bunhill Fields. And when I see the Salvation Army uniform and hear the horns, I am grateful. Now, I've had a great long time to think about what to say tonight. I became 80 years old in December. You can think of a lot of things in 80 years. And it's been fully 6 months since the committee decided that since I hadn't given the banquet address for many, many years, perhaps I could again before I become too feeble. So I've had plenty of time to think about it, and I've talked about it to many of you here. Here, I think, is the word for our time. Let us make a movement which will stir men's hearts and minds as much as did the movement of the Benedictines or the Franciscans or the leaders of the Reformation or the founders of the Salvation Army. And of course, I could have mentioned a good many others of similar nature, but these stand out with enormous evidence of power. Why shouldn't we be the Benedictines now? And just as they penetrated the paganism of so many parts of Europe, we can penetrate the confusion and fog that are around us now. We are in a very confused time. We must have millions of people in America who, whatever they say, are complete atheists. I know several thousand of them myself. They don't really believe in anything. And so life just goes on. A dull round of meaninglessness. And this is possible in spite of affluence. I know very well people with large salaries where the combined income of both husband and wife is at least 3 times as much as I ever made in my life. But they are at each other's throats, and at each other's throats partly because of finances. They can't make it. They can't pay their bills, they say. They had to have 1 car, and then 2 cars, and then a truck, and then a hi-fi, and then a bigger television, and then a new washing machine. See, there's absolutely no end to it. And many people are simply on that kind of a treadmill economically. Just keeping up. But with no sense of lift in their lives. Nothing for which they would gladly die. As you go to the meeting house at 4 minutes of 7 tomorrow morning, and we expect promptness, you understand. Many of you will pass by the bronze statue of Mary Dyer. Now, Mary Dyer's story is exactly contemporary with the story of this inscription behind me, of the people on the woodhouse. Mary Dyer was hanged on Boston Common. Hanged because she believed in something. There are 3 casts of this bronze now. One by the State House in Boston, looking over to the Common where they hanged her. Another one in Philadelphia at 15th and Cherry Street, and the third one here. And these are reminders that there have been people in the world who cared about something more than simply making more and more payments on more and more gadgets. People who had something for which they would gladly die. In my own family life, it moves me very much to know that Arnold Trueblood died in prison in 1658 in Lincoln, the very year that the Woodhouse sailed, and this motto was produced. And I have spent a great deal of my life trying to pay the debt. It's, of course, an unpaid debt. But I have the task then of trying to lift as many burdens as I possibly can. How terrible it would be to just go through this life conjugating the verb to eat. How dull. Now, we've been glad to have this excellent food tonight. But every one of us here, I believe, would share this with the hungry if we could. I wish I could have shared some of mine, because I certainly couldn't eat more than half of it. And I'm sure many of you were in the same position. Of course, we've got to have food and clothing and housing, but these ought to be incidental. The horrible thing about our present culture is we have made them central. Ever since I first really heard it, I've been saying to myself over and over, the moving words of Stephen Gillette. Oh, I wish some of you would memorize these and use them and share them with other people. I expect to pass through this world but once. Any good thing, therefore, that I can do, or any kindness I can show to any fellow creature, let me do it now. Let me not withhold or defer it. I shall not pass this way again. Here is the exact antithesis of our present sensate culture. We are a minority. But I will remind you that all of these examples of power that I have mentioned were examples of a minority. What is amazing is what a committed minority can accomplish. And it's always accomplished by working together. The great miracle of Christianity is the miracle of the church. And our hope of making a real imprint in our generation will undoubtedly come through the church. It won't come by you working alone or by you working alone. The single voice is not heard, and it certainly is not remembered. So the church is our hope. It is where a few are gathered that he is, not primarily where people are alone. I mentioned Daniel Defoe and his famous masterpiece. You notice that he did not even leave Crusoe alone. You notice that from the ship that had foundered, he was able to bring things that other people had produced. He was still dependent on others. He was not independent. The idea of the independent person is an absolute heresy and an absolute absurdity. You are not independent, and I am not independent. We need each other. And the fact that we are humble about our lives is no reason why we should not do all we can to help one another. Of course, we recognize our humility. I'm looking at the faces of people, some of whom I know very well. And I know that you share with me in a feeling of unworthiness. We are never equal to the task. But the striking thing is that people who are unequal to the task can work miracles if they are joined together. What is the new word for our time? We're stressing the word throughout this conference. Tomorrow morning, Bishop Emerson Colall will help us by explaining the spoken word. And tonight, my topic is the word for our time. I think the word is this. We have to have the church, but the church itself must be changed. The church that you and I know is not good enough. It is far too marginal in our lives. One of the biggest changes that we might bring would be a change in the conception of the ministry. I suppose the reason that it so thrills me to speak to this large company, most of whom I know, is that you already think of yourselves, for the most part, as ministers. We have formed here in Richmond a new Yokefellow Luncheon Club, which meets every Thursday. It is limited to men who think of themselves as in the ministry of daily life. We didn't know whether the thing would succeed or not. There were so many luncheon clubs already and so forth. But it is already a tremendous success after only a few months. We now have an average attendance of about 70, with more than 100 on the roll. So many are busy with their work, the doctors in the hospital, the lawyers in the courtroom and so forth. We want busy men. We want those who are making a difference in the world, and so we know they can't be there every time. But with only about half of them able to come, we're having 65 or 70 every time. And they are beginning to share with one another on how they do minister. Dr. Warwick, who is here tonight, moved us all greatly by opening up a dialogue on the ministry of medicine. Another one has dealt with the ministry of the school. How would you like to be the principal of a big high school like Richmond High School, where you have the constant problem of drugs, which the administrators face very openly? Some of you are from Connersville. 67 students in the Connersville High School have now applied for help in how to overcome the addiction to drugs. Imagine. It might be your child or mine. You can see how the principal of a high school, if he's got anything in him, has a great chance for a ministry today. You can say the same thing for the factory worker, with the people on the right and the left. The same for the judge. We have several men in our group who have engaged in the judgeship. Oh, how hard their problems are. I read the evening paper and I think of my friends on the bench. Are they going to be able to be both just and firm and fair? It's almost more than any human being could achieve. And yet they are called upon to do it. Now, if this luncheon club of Thursdays could be duplicated, if it could be spread over this nation, we could have a very big thing going. The Rotary Club was once a group in Chicago of only one club. And look at it now. It is in most of the countries of the world. I want you to realize that as Christians, you can be the people of imagination. There may be great developments that we have never even thought of before. They're bound to be. As I said earlier, the time was when the Salvation Army was not even a dream. Now we might dream of a way of reaching the average, ordinary people, the way the Salvation Army of 100 years ago was able to reach the very poor. Because people at all levels have tremendous need. And you see, it is people like you who can do this. One of the biggest steps forward that may come is in the greater use of the intellectual powers of Christian women. I mentioned the heritage of Lydia, of Philippi, but that tends to weaken and then it has to come back. I've taught philosophy for 50 years. I have never yet seen a paper without a signature where I could know whether it was by a male or a female author of a student. The girls' minds are just as good as the boys' minds. But how little we have taken advantage of this. Look at the shelves in your library, and you'll find that the imbalance is grotesque. Simply a horrible mistake. We have lost some of the leadership that we could have had. The saddest of all words are these, "It might have been." But since we cannot change the past, all we can do is to try to change the future. I have been retired from my professorship of philosophy here at Earlham for nearly 15 years. They have been marvelous years, very happy years for me and for Virginia and for our children. We've been around the world many times. We've been in many, many countries. I've had a great privilege of speaking to all kinds of people. I just noticed as I read our scripture at the breakfast table this morning that the last time we read that particular scripture was our last day in Russia. And it brought all of that back to me with a great burst of remembrance. And what I have learned is that some of the very best individual students that I've had are women. Some of them are very good in logic. One young woman came in and she said, "I'm ready for a new life." She was 32 years old. She said, "I'm sorry to tell you, but I'll be honest, I have not read a book for 10 years, between the age of 22 and 32. And she said, I need some new vitality in my life. How can I get it?" So I started her right away on Plato's Dialogues. And she just ate it up. And she wanted to do something for her teacher. Well, what could she do? She made a bust of Socrates, and if you come to my library, you'll see it sitting there. A beautiful thing. This young woman had an ability of which she was totally unaware. She had never had a course in sculpturing, but she was smart enough to know that she could do it herself. And I pointed out to her that Socrates had never had a course in philosophy. Our most famous professor at Johns Hopkins, that Keith Conning here will remember, the famous Arthur O. Lovejoy, was asked one time, how come he never had a PhD? Well, he said, somebody must give them. Isn't that nice? And one of the Harvard professors was asked why he didn't have a PhD, and he said, who could examine me? Now, friends, that is called intellectual humility. But dear friends, you don't have to have a course in everything. If there's something that interests you, get at it. Just begin. You're a grown person. And you have the enormous asset of the printed word, which helps you to bridge all the gaps of both time and space. You can be yourselves, you people here at Earlham Dining Room. You can be as close to the greatest minds that ever lived as were the people who lived as their contemporaries. And you might come closer because they may never have seen the printed word. And you can. I want you to go away from here tonight feeling that you have greater possibilities than you have ever been able to demonstrate. We deliberately left the 9 discussion groups without special topics. We want people to bring up the things that are close to their hearts. And I hope that some of the things that I have said will lead to dialogue as you gather together and finish at 10 o'clock, because every good Christian goes to bed at 10 o'clock. That is, if you are a neo-Franciscan, as I am. Most meetings last too long. And some of you are in a position to shorten them a little bit, if you will. The word for our time, I believe, is that the church can again be renewed. Always we have to have it. Always the phrase is one another. The redemptive reality is the redemptive fellowship. We used that term a lot when we began the Yoke Fellow movement 28 years ago. Now this is the 28th annual conference. And I want you to leave this place with very high hopes for your own ministry in daily life. You might be like the young woman who had the ability to make a stunning statue, but had no hint that that was the case. There may be people here who have the gift of poetry. I don't know when Mr. Shore, Gene Shore, first knew that he had the gift of song. When I first met him, he was in a federal prison. And his chance of developing this was pretty slight. Perhaps you've got a gift like that. Maybe you can learn to speak so as to touch men's hearts and minds. Why not try? Maybe you can learn to write the books that are so terribly needed. There's so many, many shoddy ones. There are never enough good ones. And it wouldn't be at all unreasonable to think that out of a company of this size, there would be people who have this ability in a very striking fashion. I want you to realize that we are in a great work. The task of spiritual renewal is one of tremendous magnitude. We do not know how much we can accomplish, but we can at least refuse to have any small plans.